So the first thing to look at really is the question of sovereignty and territorial integrity of nations under international law. Now, from the point of view of sovereignty and territorial integrity, it is a fundamental principle of international law that all nations, all member nations of the United Nations, have sovereign equality. And that means that no nation or group of nations or an organization has the right to use military force or to interfere militarily or otherwise in the internal affairs of any member state of the United Nations. This is a cardinal principle in the UN Charter. It is the fulcrum or the basis of all international affairs and dealings amongst states. This point isn't arguable. All nations accept this as a fundamental principle. Ecowas accepts it, African Union accepts it, and so on. So, the principle of non-intervention finds expression mostly in matters which are considered internal affairs of nations. No nation, no state is permitted to interfere in matters which are internal to other nations. And the question of who governs a state, the question of the governance or government of any country, is a matter which is the internal affairs of all nations. And for this reason, it is not a requirement under international law for the government of any state to enjoy recognition by other states before it becomes a government. Recognition is not required, and therefore a government can come into place in any country even though other nations do not accept it, do not recognize it. What makes a government valid is effective control by that government of the territory and its people, the ability of that government to command obedience and respect for its orders and for its rules, and the ability of that government to run the country and enter into dealings with other nations or organizations. Therefore, in terms of Niger, who governs Niger is entirely within the domestic or internal jurisdiction of Niger. It's not for Ecowas or for any other nation or any other authority or organization to tell them who should govern them. Now, in order to make this point of sovereignty and non-interference in the affairs of nations to stand under international law, the UN Charter makes it very clear that the use of force or the threat of force is forbidden. And this prohibition of the use of force is at the core of the United Nations activities. No nation is allowed or permitted to deploy force or the threat of force in order to solve its problems with other nations. And nations are enjoined to resolve their disputes peacefully. Force can only be used in limited circumstances, of which I shall come in a few minutes. So Ecowas, by threatening to use force against Niger Republic, is already in contravention of the UN Charter. And this matter of the prohibition of force or threat of force, again, is fundamental, is not arguable. Article 2.3 and Article 2.4 make these points clear. Now let's look at circumstances where force might be used lawfully under international law. There are very limited circumstances when nations might use force. The first one is self-defense. Self-defense, either individual or collective, i.e., nations have the right to use force to defend themselves or defend other nations on their invitation, who or which is being attacked or threatened with attack by other nations. This right to self-defense is established under the UN Charter Article 51 and under customary international law. Again, it's not arguable, it's settled. Second, and again related to the previous point, invitation. A nation or the government of a nation may invite the armed forces of another state into its territory to assist it for different reasons. The third exception to the ban on force is collective security, undertaking under the auspices or authority of the UN Security Council in order to maintain international peace and security. Finally, the final place or the final time or circumstance in which force can be used under international law is what we call humanitarian intervention, including what we call responsibility to protect. And this comes into play where citizens of a particular country have been subjected to gross human rights violations like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and gross abuses of human rights, to the extent that those in charge of the nation in question are the ones who are perpetrating these crimes, in which case the people of the country would need to be protected by outside powers. Of course, clearly, Niger is a sovereign state, and going by the principle of sovereignty, sovereign equality, and non-intervention in internal affairs of nations under the UN Charter, it follows, as a sovereign nation, Niger should not be subject to use of force or threat of force by Ecowas or any other organization or country. Second, as I pointed out earlier, governance or government of a country is an internal affair of each country. It is for the people of Niger Republic to decide who governs them. It is for them to say that they don't want the military. It is for them to demand that the military must go. They haven't been complaining and they haven't been asking for help from Ecowas or from anybody to come and remove the government. So in which case, Ecowas hasn't been invited. The previous government is out of power. The guy has not spoken. He isn't able to speak, to call anybody. On the contrary, the coup makers have formed a government. They control the country. They are in effective control, and they give orders and the people respect and obey them. That means they have de facto control. They are a de facto government. As I pointed out earlier, recognition is not required for validity of a government. So whether other nations like them or not, the fact is the people of Niger appear to welcome them, and they appear to be in control of governance. Next, there is no self-defense situation in the country of Niger warranting collective self-defense. In any case, the government of Niger hasn't invited anyone to come and help it to defend anything. Then, there isn't any humanitarian situation or crisis that warrants intervention on human rights grounds. The coup was bloodless. Nobody was killed in government. No civilians were hurt. And people are going about their normal daily activities without harassment, without molestation. And in fact, people appear to support the military government. There's no civil war in Niger. People are not fighting one another. There are no factions fighting for power. There's no crisis. And there's no threat to regional or international peace and security because of the coup in Niger. And therefore, we cannot even invoke Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to mandate an intervention to restore peace and security. In any case, the UN Security Council hasn't authorized any use of force in Niger. Any intervention by Ecowas is likely to create in Niger and West Africa, including Nigeria, a humanitarian crisis, a refugee crisis that presently does not exist. So which means such intervention will be counterproductive.